Imagine a man at the top of the world, wealth beyond measure, a city at his feet, yet haunted by a single choice that echoes through decades. What happens when the past he buried walks through the door, holding a secret that could unravel everything? Stick around to find out how one letter, one moment rewrites a life. If you love stories of redemption, hit that like button and subscribe. We're just getting started. The penthouse office of Grayson Enterprises perched atop Chicago's skyline, like a throne carved from glass and steel. Thomas Grayson, 62, sat behind a desk of polished ebony, his reflection shimmering faintly in its surface, a man sculpted by time and ambition, his gray hair swept back, his jaw set hard. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering tapestry of lights, but his eyes, sharp and unyielding, saw none of it. He cradled a crystal tumbler of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the glow of a single desk lamp, the only warmth in a room otherwise cloaked in shadow. He'd just signed a deal worth $12 million, a victory that would headline tomorrow's papers. Yet the silence around him felt heavier than the triumph. The faint hum of the city filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a reminder of the world he'd conquered. The office was a monument to his discipline, leather chairs aligned with military precision, a wall of awards gleaming under soft recessed lights, a single abstract painting, a swirl of blues and grays, hanging like a cryptic confession. Thomas took a slow sip, the burn of the whiskey grounding him. He didn't celebrate victories with champagne or crowds. He preferred this, the solitude, the control. It was the only way he'd survived. His mind drifted unbidden to Clara. 35 years ago, her voice had been soft, pleading. "Don't go, Tom. We can make it work." As she stood in their cramped apartment, her hand resting on a barely there swell of pregnancy. He'd walked away, suitcase in hand, the door slamming shut on her tears. Love was a risk, a crack in the armor he couldn't afford. He'd chosen Grayson Enterprises over her, over the child he'd never met, convincing himself that power was the only legacy worth leaving. Now, at the peak of his empire, that choice haunted him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. The door clicked open, and his assistant Margaret stepped in, a wiry woman in her 50s, her clipboard a shield against his moods. "Mr. Grayson, the invitation for the charity gala came again. They're insistent you attend." Her voice was clipped, professional, but her eyes flicked to the tumbler in his hand. Thomas set the glass down with a deliberate clink. "Tell them I'm busy," he said, his tone flat, final. "I don't have time for their nonsense." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "They'll be disappointed. It's a big night. Your name on the donor list could—" "I don't need anyone clapping for me, Margaret," he cut in, his voice sharpening like a blade. "I just need them to fear me." He leaned back, the leather creaking under his weight, and waved her off. She retreated, the door closing with a soft thud, leaving him alone again. Fear. That was his currency. Not love, not trust. Those were luxuries for weaker men. He'd built Grayson Enterprises from a failing startup into a titan of industry. Every decision a brick in the wall between him and vulnerability. Clara had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment he'd corrected with cold precision. Yet tonight, her memory lingered, sharper than the whiskey's bite. He could still see her standing by that chipped formica table, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, her eyes wide with hope he'd extinguished. He rose, crossing to the window. The city's pulse a faint vibration against the glass. His reflection stared back, an older man, lines etched deep around his mouth, a hardness in his gaze that hadn't been there at 27. He'd won, hadn't he? The contracts, the headlines, the wealth, proof he'd been right to walk away. So why did the victory taste like ash? His fingers brushed the edge of a small drawer in his desk, one he rarely opened. Inside lay a single photograph, edges worn from years of secret glances. He pulled it out, the image trembling slightly in his hand. Clara smiled at him from the faded print, her arm looped through his, the wind tousling her hair on a pier by Lake Michigan. They'd been young, reckless, certain the world would bend for them. He'd kept it all these years, a relic of the man he might have been. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across the room, and Thomas shoved the photo back into the drawer, slamming it shut. Sentiment was a trap. He turned off the light, plunging the office into darkness, save for the city's glow beyond the glass. Crossing to the painting on the wall, a chaotic blend of strokes he'd bought for its price tag, not its meaning. He stared into its depths. It mirrored something inside him, a storm he'd never named, a void he'd filled with power. He returned to his chair, the whiskey untouched now, growing warm in its glass. The gala invitation sat on his desk, a taunting white square. He could picture it. Men in tuxedos, women in gowns, all eager to shake his hand, to bask in his shadow. He'd gone once, years ago, and left early, the chatter grating against his nerves. No, he wouldn't go. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need anyone. Yet as he sat there, the silence pressing in, a faint ache stirred beneath his ribs. Not sharp, not urgent, but persistent. It wasn't the deal, the company, or even the whiskey. It was Clara's voice, echoing across decades, soft and unbroken. "Don't go, Tom." He clenched his jaw, forcing the memory down. He was Thomas Grayson, untouchable, unyielding. Whatever ghosts lingered, they couldn't reach him here. The city lights winked below, indifferent. To his vigil, he stayed there, alone. The king of a kingdom built on steel and solitude, unaware that the past was already knocking at his door. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton shimmered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 golden sparks across the polished marble floor. Thomas Grayson stood near the edge of the crowd, a solitary figure in a sea of tuxedos and silk gowns. The air buzzed with laughter and the clink of champagne flutes, the kind of orchestrated elegance that Chicago's elite thrived on. He'd come reluctantly, pressured by a board member's insistence that his presence at the charity gala would polish Grayson Enterprises' image. His jaw tightened as he adjusted his cufflinks. Platinum, understated, a quiet declaration of his status. He didn't belong here, amid the shallow smiles and hollow praise. A string quartet played a mournful rendition of Vivaldi, the notes weaving through the din. Thomas sipped his tonic water, the absence of alcohol a deliberate choice tonight. He needed his wits sharp, his control absolute. The room was a theater, and he was no actor, just a man who'd rather be alone in his penthouse, staring down the city he'd mastered. He scanned the faces, philanthropists, CEOs, a few politicians, angling for his favor. None of them mattered. He was here to be seen, not to connect. Then she appeared. A young woman slipped through the throng, her steps purposeful, yet unhurried, like a shadow moving against the tide. She was no more than 27, her dark hair pulled into a simple knot, her dress a modest navy that stood out against the gala's extravagance. Thomas's eyes narrowed as she approached, something about her tugging at a thread deep in his memory. She stopped before him, close enough that he caught the faint scent of lavender, ordinary grounding out of place in this perfumed chaos. In her hand she held a folded letter, its edges yellowed and creased as if it had been carried too long. "You're Thomas Grayson," she said, her voice steady but low, cutting through the quartet's swell. It wasn't a question. He straightened, his gaze locking onto hers. Her eyes were hazel, sharp with a quiet intensity that unnerved him. "And you are?" he replied, his tone clipped, a shield against the intrusion. She didn't flinch. "My name's Emily." She extended the letter, her fingers steady. "My mother said you need to see this." Thomas hesitated, the weight of her words sinking. And he took the paper, its texture rough against his fingertips, and unfolded it with a precision born of habit. The handwriting was his own, bold, angular, unmistakably from a younger version of himself. "Clara, I'll always be there. We'll build something real. Forever yours, Tom." The words hit him like a punch to the chest, dragging him back 35 years to a cramped apartment, to Clara's soft voice whispering dreams he'd buried. His breath caught, a rare crack in his composure. He looked up, searching Emily's face. There it was, the curve of her jaw, the faint tilt of her nose. echoes of Clara he couldn't deny. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low, controlled, though his pulse betrayed him. "It's yours," Emily said simply. She kept it. All of them. Her gaze held his, unflinching. "I'm Clara Bennett's daughter." The room seemed to tilt, the chatter fading into a distant hum. Clara's daughter, the child he'd walked away from, or so he'd thought. His mind raced, piecing together the impossible. He'd assumed Clara had moved on, built a life without him, maybe lost the baby or given it up. He'd never checked, never dared. Now this woman stood before him, a living ghost of a choice he'd locked away. "Why now?" he asked, folding the letter with deliberate care, his hands steady despite the storm inside. "What do you want?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flickering with something, pain, resolve. He couldn't tell. "I don't want your money if that's what you're thinking," she said, her voice edged with quiet defiance. "I came because she asked me to. That's all you need to know for now." Before he could respond, she turned, slipping back into the crowd as swiftly as she'd come. Thomas stood frozen, the letter a burning weight in his hand. Around him, the gala pulsed on. Glasses clinked. A woman laughed too loudly. But he was alone in a way he hadn't felt in years. He slipped the paper into his jacket pocket, its presence a splinter under his skin. "Mr. Grayson?" A voice broke through, a portly man in a bow tie, some donor eager for a handshake. Thomas nodded curtly, his mask sliding back into place. "Good to see you here," the man prattled. "Your support means everything." "Excuse me," Thomas cut in, his tone smooth but final. He moved toward the balcony doors, needing air, needing space. The cool night breeze hit him as he stepped outside, the city's skyline sprawling before him. A kingdom he'd built, now trembling at its foundation. He pulled the letter out again, rereading it under the faint glow of a wall sconce. "Forever, yours, Tom." He'd been a fool then, believing in promises, in love. He'd walked away from Clara because he feared failure, feared a life where he couldn't control the outcome. Now Emily's words echoed. She kept it. Clara had held on to him even after he'd let her go. Why? The door behind him swung open, a burst of laughter spilling out before it closed again. Thomas folded the letter, tucking it away once more. His fingers brushed the railing, cold metal grounding him. He wouldn't chase her down, not yet. He was Thomas Grayson, a man who didn't bend, didn't break, whatever this was. He'd face it on his terms. But as he stared into the night, the city lights blurring at the edges, a question gnawed at him, sharp and unyielding. What had Clara wanted him to see? And why, after all these years, did it still matter? The answer lingered just beyond his grasp, a shadow moving closer, ready to step into the light. The morning after the gala, Thomas Grayson's world tilted on its axis. He stood in his penthouse office, the Chicago skyline a gray smear. Beyond the glass, his hands clasped behind his back to steady the tremor he refused to acknowledge. The letter from Clara, Emily's quiet bombshell, lay folded on his desk, its edges taunting him like an unopened wound. He'd barely slept. The words, "Forever yours," Tom looping through his mind. A ghost he couldn't banish. But now, a new storm was brewing, one he hadn't foreseen. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a news alert. Grayson Enterprises CEO linked to secret daughter. Scandal threatens empire. Thomas's jaw clenched as he scanned the headline, the words slicing through his carefully built armor. The story was thin, speculation about Emily's appearance at the gala, a blurry photo of her handing him the letter. But it was enough. The press had scented blood, and they wouldn't stop until they'd torn something open. The door swung open, and Margaret strode in, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline. "It's everywhere, sir," she said, her voice tight. "CNN, Bloomberg, even the local rags. They're calling it a mystery heir. The board's already asking questions." Thomas turned, his gaze cold but steady. "Let them ask," he said, his tone a blade honed by decades of control. "I'll handle it." Margaret hesitated, her lips thinning. There's more. Edward Langston's on line 1. He says it's urgent. Edward. The name hit Thomas like a fist, stirring a bitterness he'd buried deep. Once his closest friend, Edward had turned rival 20 years ago, clawing his way up the energy sector with a ruthlessness that mirrored Thomas's own, until it didn't. Edward thrived on chaos, while Thomas built order. Now the past was circling back, and Thomas knew this call wasn't a coincidence. He picked up the receiver, his voice flat. "What do you want, Edward?" A low chuckle crackled through the line. "Good morning to you too, Tom. I see you're making headlines again. A daughter, huh? Quite the plot twist for the untouchable Thomas Grayson." Edward's tone dripped with mockery, each word a calculated jab. Thomas gripped the phone tighter, but his face remained a mask. "Get to the point." "The point?" Edward laughed again, sharp and hollow. "Your honor's turning to ash, old friend. The board won't like this mess. Neither will your investors. I'd hate to see Grayson Enterprises crumble over a little family drama." "It won't," Thomas said, his voice ice cold. "You should know better than to bet against me." "Oh, I'm not betting," Edward replied. "I'm just watching, and maybe fanning the flames a bit. Enjoy the spotlight, Tom." The line went dead. Thomas set the receiver down with deliberate calm, his knuckles white against the black plastic. Edward wasn't bluffing. He'd relish any chance to topple Thomas, to claim the throne they'd once dreamed of sharing. But this wasn't about business anymore. It was personal. And Emily was the spark. He needed answers. Ignoring Margaret's hovering presence, he grabbed his coat and the letter, heading for the elevator. The drive to Brooklyn was a blur, Chicago's steel towers giving way to narrower streets, brick row houses stained by time. Emily's address, tracked down by a discreet call to a private investigator, led him to a sagging 2-story building, its paint peeling like old skin. He climbed the steps, the creak of wood under his polished shoes, an alien sound, and knocked. Tuck, door opened, and Emily stood there, her hazel eyes narrowing at the sight of him. She wore a faded sweater, her hands gripping a chipped mug of tea. Behind her, the kitchen was small, dim, a single bulb casting shadows over a worn table. The simplicity of it jarred against the life Thomas knew, yet it felt achingly familiar. A faint echo of Clara's old apartment. "What do you want?" Emily asked, her voice steady but guarded. Thomas held up the letter, his posture rigid. "We need to talk. This," he gestured to the paper, "is everywhere now. They're saying you're my daughter. I need you to deny it. Publicly." Emily's lips curled slightly, not a smile but a flicker of disdain. "So you can keep your precious image?" She stepped aside, letting him in, though her stance made it clear this wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. "I'm not here to play your game, Mr. Grayson." He entered, the scent of chamomile tea mingling with the musty air. "It's not a game," he said, his voice low, controlled. "It's my life, my company. I'll pay you, whatever you need to make this go away." Emily set the mug down with a soft clink, her eyes locking onto his. "I don't sell my mother for your money," she said, each word deliberate, cutting. "She's sick, dying, and all she wanted was for you. To know I exist, that's why I came, not for you, for her." The room seemed to shrink, the weight of her words pressing against Thomas's chest. Sick, dying. Clara's face flashed in his mind, young, hopeful, then broken as he'd walked away. He'd assumed she'd built a new life, not this, not illness, not struggle. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice quieter now, the edge softening despite himself. Emily studied him, as if weighing his worth. "A nursing home. Southside. She doesn't want your pity, and neither do I." She turned away, pouring more tea, her movements steady, but her shoulders tense. Thomas stood there, the letter a lead weight in his pocket. Edward's threat loomed, the press circling like vultures, yet Emily's words carved deeper. Clara was dying, and he'd known nothing. His empire, his honor, None of it shielded him from this truth. He could force her to retract, hire lawyers, spin the story, but something held him back. A flicker of the man he'd once been. The one who'd written those promises. "I'll go," he said finally, turning toward the door. "But this isn't over." Emily didn't look up. "It never was," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the kettle. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face, the city's hum a distant roar. Edward's laughter echoed in his ears, the press's headlines a noose, tightening around his neck. Yet it was Clara's shadow, sick, silent, waiting, that followed him most fiercely. For the first time in decades, Thomas Grayson felt the ground beneath him shift, and he wasn't sure he could control where it led. The Southside nursing home smelled of antiseptic and faded flowers, a stark contrast to the polished sterility of Thomas Grayson's world. He stood in the doorway of room 17, his tailored coat out of place against the chipped paint and flickering fluorescent lights. Clara Bennett lay in a narrow bed, her frail frame swallowed by a thin blanket, her once dark hair now streaked with silver. Beside her, a small clay pot held a wilting violet, its leaves drooping as if mirroring her struggle. Thomas's chest tightened, a rare breach in the wall he'd built around himself. This wasn't the Clara he'd left. This was a woman time had worn down, yet her eyes, when they met his, still held that quiet fire he'd never forgotten. He stepped inside, the letter from 35 years ago burning a hole in his pocket. The room was silent save for the soft beep of a monitor, a rhythm too slow for comfort. Clara turned her head, her gaze settling on him with a mixture of recognition and resignation. "Tom," she said, her voice a fragile thread barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd come." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. "Emily told me," he said, keeping his tone even, though his hands clenched at his sides. "She said you're sick. Why didn't you—" He stopped, the question pointless. He hadn't given her a reason to reach out, not after he'd walked away. Clara's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Sit," she said, nodding to a chair beside the bed. He obeyed, the plastic creaking under his weight, a humbling sound for a man used to leather and luxury. She watched him for a moment, her breath shallow, then spoke. "Emily's not yours, Tom." The words landed like a stone, heavy and cold. Thomas blinked, his mind racing to catch up. "What?" he managed, his voice low, steady, though a crack trembled beneath it. "She's Edward's," Clara said, her eyes locking onto his, unflinching despite her weakness. "After you left, I was alone, broke. Edward came around, your friend, your shadow. He was drunk one night, angry you'd outshone him. I said no, but—" She paused, her gaze drifting to the violet, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "He didn't listen. Emily was born 9 months later." Thomas's breath stopped, the room shrinking to the space between them. Edward Langston, his confidant, his betrayer, hadn't just stolen contracts or boardroom victories. He'd taken something far more primal, leaving Clara to bear the cost. Thomas's hands gripped the chair's arms, knuckles whitening, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara's eyes softened, a trace of the woman he'd loved peering through. "You were gone, Tom, building your empire. I didn't want your pity or his. I kept her, raised her as mine. She doesn't know he's her father. I never told her." The weight of her words pressed down, a tide of guilt and rage threatening to drown him. He saw it now. Clara, pregnant and abandoned, facing Edward's violence alone, then choosing to shield Emily from both men's shadows. He'd walked away, yes, but Edward had struck deeper, and Clara had carried it all. "You should have told me," he said, his voice rougher now, though he kept it level. "I could have what?" Clara interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "Come back? Saved me? I didn't need saving, Tom. I needed a life for her." She reached for the violet, her fingers trembling as they brushed its leaves. "I worked 2 jobs, sewed clothes at night. She grew up strong. That's what mattered." Thomas stared at her hand, the thinness of her wrist, the calluses still etched into her skin. He remembered her standing in that old apartment begging him to stay, her voice breaking as he turned away. He'd thought her weak then, a tether he couldn't afford. Now he saw the truth. She'd been the strong one, forging a path through his wreckage and Edward's cruelty. "Why now?" he asked, echoing his question to Emily, his eyes searching hers. "Why send her to me?" Clara's hand fell back, to the blanket, her breath hitching. "I'm dying," she said simply. "Cancer, months, maybe less." Emily's alone now, and she deserves to know where she came from. Not Edward's part, but yours. You owed her that much. The monitor's beep filled the silence, a metronome to his unraveling. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face a mask of control hiding the storm within. "I didn't know," he said, the words tasting like ash. "If I'd known about Edward, about her, you wouldn't have stayed." Clara finished, her voice soft but certain. "You chose your path, Tom. I don't blame you for it anymore." She reached out, her hand cool as it touched his. "I forgave you years ago. Now you need to forgive yourself." Her touch was a jolt, a bridge to a past he'd buried. He didn't pull away, though every instinct screamed to retreat. "And Emily?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What does she need?" "She needs a father," Clara said, her eyes glistening but resolute. "Not Edward's kind, yours. I don't want your money or your name, just be there, that's all I ask." Thomas sat back, her hand slipping from his, the warmth fading too quickly. The letter in his pocket felt heavier now, its promises a mockery of the man he'd become. Edward's betrayal, Clara's sacrifice, Emily's existence. It was a tangled web he hadn't woven but couldn't escape. He could walk away again, let the press devour the story, let Edward win. But Clara's eyes held him, steady and unyielding, a mirror to the honor he'd lost. "I'll think about it," he said finally, rising, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest. "I need time." Clara nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "You always did," she murmured, her gaze drifting back to the violet. He left the room, the antiseptic smell clinging to him as he stepped into the hall. The city waited beyond these walls, Edward's taunts, the press's hunger, Grayson Enterprises teetering on the edge. But it was Clara's words that followed him, soft and relentless. "Forgive yourself." For the first time in decades, Thomas Grayson felt the weight of his own choices and the strength it would take to face them. The press conference room at Grayson Enterprises buzzed with anticipation, a hive of cameras and microphones poised like weapons. Thomas Grayson stood at the back, his silhouette framed by the glass wall overlooking Chicago's restless skyline. The air was thick with the hum of whispered speculation, the reporters' eyes glinting with hunger for the kill. Edward Langston had struck first, hours after Thomas's visit to Clara. A televised interview aired, Edward's voice dripping with venom. "Thomas Grayson's a fraud. A man who abandons his own can't lead an empire." The words had ignited a firestorm, and now the board demanded answers. Thomas adjusted his tie, the silk smooth against his fingers, a ritual to steady himself. The letter from Clara rested in his jacket pocket, its weight a quiet anchor amid the chaos. He'd spent the night replaying her words. She needs a father. Yours. And Edward's betrayal, a wound reopened after decades. His empire teetered, the press bayed, yet it was Clara's frail hand on his that lingered most, a call he couldn't ignore. The boardroom doors opened, and he stepped into the fray. The lights flared, a barrage of flashes blinding him momentarily, but his stride remained even, his face a mask of granite. Edward stood at the podium, his silver hair catching the glare, a smirk playing on his lips as he spotted Thomas. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward began, his voice booming through the speakers, "we're here to address the rot at Grayson Enterprises' core. Thomas Grayson, your untouchable titan, hides a past of cowardice, a daughter he denies, a scandal he can't bury." The crowd erupted, questions flying like shrapnel. "Is it true? Who's the girl? Will you resign? Thomas moved forward, his presence silencing the room not with force but with the sheer weight of his stillness. He took the podium from Edward, their shoulders brushing, a fleeting contact that carried years of bitterness. Edward stepped back, his smirk widening, but Thomas didn't glance at him. He faced the cameras, his voice low, steady, cutting through the noise. I've built this company on principles, he said, each word deliberate, honed. Discipline, integrity, results. You've seen the headlines, you've heard the rumors. I'm here to set the record straight. Not for you, not for him. He nodded toward Edward without looking, but for someone who deserves it. The room held its breath, the tension a palpable thread. Thomas paused, his hand resting lightly on the podium, the letter's outline pressing against his chest. Emily Bennett is not my daughter by blood, he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd unflinching. But she's mine by choice. Her mother, Clara, was someone I failed once. I won't fail her again. A murmur rippled through the reporters, 10 scratching furiously. Edward's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing, but Thomas pressed on. I've led Grayson Enterprises for 30 years. I've given it everything, more than I should have. Today, I'm stepping down as chairman, not because of your noise, not because of his lies, another nod to Edward, but because some things matter more than power. The room exploded again, shouts overlapping, but Thomas raised a hand, silencing them with quiet authority. I choose family, he said, his voice firm, final. That's all. He stepped back, turning from the podium, the cameras flashing like a storm breaking around him. Edward lunged forward, seizing the microphone. You think this saves you? He spat, his composure cracking. You're finished, Tom. A quitter doesn't get to walk away clean. Thomas paused, half turning, his eyes meeting Edward's for the first time. I don't need to be clean, he said, his tone calm, unshaken. I just need to be right. He walked out, the clamor fading behind him, Edward's voice a distant echo swallowed by the closing doors. The drive to the nursing home was a quiet descent, the city's roar muted by his resolve. He arrived as dusk settled, the sky a bruise of purple and gold. Clara's room was dimmer now, the violet by her bedside curling inward, its fight nearly gone. She lay still, her breathing shallow, her eyes half open as he entered. Thomas crossed to her, sinking into the chair, his coat draped over its back, a shedding of the man he'd been. Clara, he said softly, taking her hand. Her skin was cool, fragile, but her fingers curled faintly around his. I did it. I told them. Emily's safe now. Her eyes flickered, a spark of recognition. Tom, she whispered, her voice a thread unraveling. You didn't have to. I did, he cut in, gentle but firm. I should have done it years ago. For you. For her. He squeezed her hand, the warmth of his grip a lifeline against her fading strength. I'll protect her. I promise. Clara's lips trembled, a ghost of a smile breaking through. Good, she breathed, her eyes glistening. That's enough. Her hand slackened, her chest rising once, twice, then stilling. The monitor flatlined, a single note piercing. The silence. And Thomas bowed his head, holding her hand as the room grew quiet. He stayed there, minutes stretching into eternity, until a nurse gently touched his shoulder. He rose, folding Clara's hand across her chest, the violet cradled beside her. The letter stayed in his pocket, its promises no longer hollow. He stepped into the hall, the antiseptic air sharp against his lungs, and pulled out his phone. Edward's last taunt rang in his ears. A quitter doesn't get to walk away clean, but it held no power now. He dialed Margaret. Tell the board it's final, he said, his voice steady, resolute. I'm done. He hung up before she could reply, the weight of Grayson Enterprises slipping from his shoulders like a coat too long worn. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent to his surrender. Thomas stood under the nursing home's awning, rain beginning to fall in soft silver threads. Clara was gone, Edward's victory hollow, the press a fading echo. Yet Emily remained, a thread he wouldn't sever. For the first time in decades, Thomas Grayson felt unburdened, not by power or fear, but by a choice made not for himself, but for someone else. The storm had broken, and he stood tall within it. The small house on the edge of Chicago's suburbs smelled of damp earth and fresh paint, a world away from the glass towers Thomas Grayson had once ruled. He stood in the kitchen, an apron tied awkwardly over his pressed shirt, staring at a tray of dough he'd meant to shape into bread. The oven ticked behind him, its heat a quiet hum against the stillness. 2 days had passed since Clara's death, since he'd walked away from Grayson Enterprises, and now he was here, trying to build something new with Emily, the daughter he'd claimed not by blood, but by choice. The house was modest, a rental he'd secured with a single call, its wooden floors scuffed but warm, its walls bare save for a faded print of wildflowers above the sink. Emily sat at the table, her arms crossed, her hazel eyes watching him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. She'd agreed to come, not eagerly, but with a nod that spoke more of exhaustion than trust. Thomas had driven her here in silence, the weight of Clara's passing a bridge neither knew how to cross. He slid the tray into the oven, the dough lumpy and uneven, a far cry from the precision he'd once demanded. "It's supposed to rise," he said, wiping flour from his hands, his voice steady but tinged with self-awareness. "I might have missed a step." Emily's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile breaking through her guarded expression. "It's burning already," she said, nodding toward the faint smoke curling from the oven's edges. Thomas turned, yanking the door open, and a wave of heat hit him as he pulled out the tray. The bread, or what should have been bread, was a charred mess, black at the edges, the kitchen filling with an acrid tang. He set it on the counter, staring at it, then let out a low, dry laugh, the first in years. "Well," he said, meeting her gaze, "I never claimed to be a baker." Emily's smile widened, brief but real, and for a moment the room softened. She stood, crossing to the sink, and filled a glass with water. "Mom tried to teach me once," she said, her voice quiet, carrying the weight of memory. She said, "Bread's like people. It needs time to grow." Thomas leaned against the counter, the flour dusting his sleeves, a badge of his fumbling effort. "Clara loved simple things," he said, his tone softening. "Flowers, bread, that old apartment we had. I used to think she was naive, wanting a life I couldn't give her." Emily turned, the glass in her hand, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You could have," she said, not accusing but firm. "You just didn't. She told me how you left, said you were scared of failing her." The word stung, a truth he'd dodged for decades, but Thomas didn't flinch. He nodded, slow and deliberate, letting them settle. "She was right," he admitted, his voice low, steady. "I was terrified. Not of her. Of me. I thought power was the only thing I could control. I was wrong." Emily studied him, her fingers tightening around the glass. "You can't change that now," she said, her tone edged with the years she'd lived without him. "You don't get to walk in and fix it with burnt bread and a house." "I know," Thomas replied, his gaze unwavering. "I don't expect you to forgive me or trust me. I'm not here to buy your faith, Emily. I'm here to earn it." He paused, then stepped closer, his voice dropping to a raw, unguarded note. "Your mother asked me to be there for you. I failed her once. I won't again." The air between them thickened, her silence a wall he couldn't breach, not yet. Emily set the glass down, her movements careful, deliberate, then crossed to the back door. "Come outside," she said, her voice neutral but not cold. "It's stuffy in here." Thomas followed, stepping onto a small porch overlooking a patchy yard. The evening sky streaked with amber and gray. Emily pulled 2 chairs from a corner, their wood weathered but sturdy, and sat, gesturing for him to join her. He did, the chair creaking under his weight, the sound grounding him in this unfamiliar space. She reached into a rusted metal box by the steps and pulled out a bundle of kindling, then a match. "Mom liked fires," she said, striking the match and setting it to the wood in a shallow pit. The flame caught, small at first, then grew, casting a warm glow across her face. Said they reminded her of hope, something that starts weak, but gets stronger. Thomas watched the fire, its crackle filling the quiet. "She saw hope where I didn't," he said, his voice soft, reflective. "I remember her planting flowers in that apartment, little pots on the sill. I'd come home late, and she'd be there watering them, smiling like they were enough. I never understood." Emily's eyes stayed on the flames, her expression unreadable. "They were enough for her," she said. "You weren't." The truth landed gently, a blade sheathed in memory, and Thomas nodded again, accepting it. "No," he said. "I spent 30 years building something I thought mattered. It didn't. She did. You do." Emily didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the fire as it climbed higher, the smoke curling into the dusk. Thomas sat beside her, the heat brushing his face, a quiet companion to the ache in his chest. He didn't push, didn't demand. For once he let the moment be, her presence, the fire, the weight of his promise to Clara. As night deepened, Emily leaned back, her head resting against the chair, her eyes half closed. The firelight danced across her features, softening the lines of doubt. Thomas watched her, a stillness settling over him, and when her breathing slowed, he realized she'd fallen asleep. He didn't move, didn't wake her. Instead, he stayed, the first flame of something new flickering between them. Not trust, not yet, but a beginning. The city hummed faintly in the distance, its towers no longer his domain. Thomas Grayson, once a king of steel and solitude, sat by a fire in a yard he didn't own, guarding a daughter he hadn't sired, and for the first time, he felt no need to control what came next. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the suburban house, casting long shadows across the patchy yard where Thomas Grayson knelt, his hands deep in the soil. Beside him, Emily, smooth dirt around a cluster of marigolds, their golden petals a quiet tribute to Clara's love of simple beauty. A week had passed since the night by the fire, and the fragile bond between them had begun to take root. Tentative, unspoken, but real. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow, the earth under his nails a stark contrast to the manicured hands that once signed million-dollar deals. He glanced at Emily, her focus steady on the flowers, and felt a flicker of something he hadn't known in decades. Peace. The moment shattered when the mail arrived. Emily rose to fetch it, returning with a single envelope. No stamp, no return address, just her name scrawled in sharp, familiar ink. She tore it open, her face tightening as she read. "It's from Edward," she said, her voice low, edged with unease. She handed it to Thomas, her fingers brushing his with a tremor she couldn't hide. He unfolded the letter, the words leaping off the page like a coiled threat. "Emily, your father thinks he's won. Tell the press you're my blood, or I'll do it myself. Grayson's honor won't survive the truth." Thomas's jaw clenched, a surge of cold fury rising, but he forced it down, his breathing slow and deliberate. Edward hadn't let go. He'd found a new lever, one aimed at Emily's quiet strength. "He's bluffing," Thomas said, folding the letter with precise care, his voice calm despite the storm within. "He won't risk his own reputation." Emily's eyes met his, sharp and searching. "Will he? He's got nothing to lose. You walked away. He didn't." She crossed her arms, the marigolds forgotten. "If he tells them I'm his, it's not just you he'll hurt. It's Mom's memory." Thomas stood brushing dirt from his knees, his posture unyielding. "He won't get that far," he said, his tone firm, a promise forged in resolve. "I'll handle it." That evening, he drove into the city, the skyline looming like a challenge he'd once conquered. Edward had suggested a meeting, a civil chat, his message claimed, via a curt voicemail left on Thomas's old office line. Thomas agreed, choosing a quiet cafe on Michigan Avenue, its wood-paneled walls and soft jazz a neutral ground. He arrived first, settling into a corner booth, his coffee black and untouched as he waited. Edward entered minutes later, his silver hair gleaming under the dim lights, his suit crisp despite the hour. He slid into the seat across from Thomas, his smirk a familiar weapon. "You look rustic, Tom," he said, eyeing Thomas's rolled-up sleeves. "Gardening suits you better than boardrooms." Thomas leaned back, his expression impassive. "Say what you came to say, Edward." Edward's smirk widened, but his eyes were cold. "I've got a story for the press. Your little Emily, my daughter, abandoned by both of us. It's poetic, really. You play the hero, I play the villain, and we both go down in flames. Unless she talks first, admits it, saves your skin." Thomas's fingers rested lightly on the table, steady, unshaken. "She's not your pawn," he said, his voice low, controlled. "And neither am I. You want to burn me? Go ahead. I've got nothing left to lose." Edward laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "Nothing? You're clinging to some noble fantasy, Tom. She's not even yours. She's mine. You think you can erase that with a few flowers and a sob story?" Thomas met his gaze, unflinching. "She's mine because I chose her," he said, each word a quiet blade. "You didn't. You ran. From Clara. From her. From everything. You don't get to claim her now." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You can't take what I've found, Edward. Not this time." Edward's smirk faltered, his hand tightening around his coffee cup. "You're a fool," he snapped, his composure slipping. "I'll bury you both." Thomas stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "Do it," he said, his tone even unshaken. "I'm not afraid of you anymore because I'm not alone." He walked out, leaving Edward staring after him, the jazz notes swallowing the silence of his retreat. Back at the house, night had fallen, the air cool and heavy with the promise of rain. Thomas found Emily in the yard, the fire pit glowing again, its flames licking at the darkness. She looked up as he approached, her eyes shadowed but steady. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice quiet. He sat beside her, the chair creaking, under his weight. "He wants you to tell the world you're his," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "To hurt me." I told him no. Emily's hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. "And if he does it anyway?" "Then we face it," Thomas replied, his gaze on the fire. "Together. But there's something you need to know first." He took a breath, the words heavy but necessary. "Clara didn't just protect you from me, she protected you from him. Edward's your father by blood. She kept it from you, from him, because she wanted you free." Emily's breath hitched, her eyes widening, but she didn't pull away. "Why didn't she tell me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "She loved you," Thomas said, his hand resting near hers, not touching, offering. "She saw what he was, what I was, and chose you over both of us. I'm telling you now because you deserve the truth, and because I'm here, Emily. Not as his shadow, but as yours." Rain began to fall, soft and silver, hissing as it met the fire. Emily stared into the flames, tears mingling with the drops on her face, then leaned into him, her shoulder brushing his. "Mom wanted this," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "She wanted you here." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Call me what you want. Tom, Thomas, anything. Just let me stay." She turned, her eyes meeting his, and after a long moment she said, "Dad." The word was small, fragile, but it landed like a cornerstone. Rain soaked them both, the fire sputtering, and she hugged him, her arms fierce around his shoulders. Thomas held her back, the soil still on his hands, the marigolds glistening in the wet. Edward's threat loomed, but it was powerless here. Dignity wasn't in titles or triumphs, it was in this, in the quiet strength of a bond reclaimed. A year had slipped by since the rain-soaked night when Emily first called him Dad, and the small house on Chicago's outskirts had become a home. Thomas Grayson stood on the porch, the morning sun spilling gold across the yard, painting the marigolds he and Emily had planted in vibrant hues. The air carried the scent of fresh earth and coffee brewing inside, a quiet symphony of the life he'd chosen over the towers of Grayson Enterprises. His hands, once pristine tools of power, now bore the faint scars of gardening, calluses earned not in boardrooms, but in soil. Inside, Emily moved with a purpose that had grown steadier over the months. She'd taken a job at a local library, her days spent among books rather than the shadows of her past. The fire pit in the yard stood cold now, its ashes swept away, but its memory lingered, a spark that had kindled something enduring. Thomas watched her through the screen door as she set 2 mugs on the table, her dark hair catching the light, her smile small but unguarded. She'd healed, not fully, but enough, and he'd been there to see it. He stepped back into the yard, his boots sinking slightly into the dew-kissed grass, and knelt by the flower bed. The marigolds thrived, their golden heads nodding in the breeze, a living echo of Clara's spirit. Thomas brushed a petal, its softness, a contrast to the hardness he'd once worn like armor. He'd written her a letter last night, words he'd never send, folded into the old wooden box where her promises to him still rested. Clara, you taught me what honor is. It's not the empire I built, it's this thank you for her. He'd left it there, a quiet farewell to the woman who'd reshaped him. The screen door creaked, and Emily emerged, a sketch pad tucked under her arm, her mug steaming in her hand. "You're up early," she said, settling into a chair on the porch, her voice warm with the ease they'd earned. "Couldn't sleep," Thomas replied, rising to join her. He took the second mug she'd left out, the coffee's bitterness a familiar comfort. "Too much to think about." She opened the sketch pad, revealing a drawing, 3 figures by a fire, their outlines soft but distinct. "I finished it last night," she said, tilting it toward him. "It's us. Mom's there too, in the middle." Thomas studied it, his throat tightening. Clara's form was faint, a suggestion of her smile, flanked by him and Emily, their hands linked through the flames. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice low, steady, though emotion trembled beneath. "She'd love it." Emily nodded, her fingers tracing the edges. "I think so too. She always said you'd find your way back, not to her, but to something good." She paused, then met his gaze. "You did." The words settled over him, a balm to wounds he'd carried too long. He set the mug down, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "I didn't deserve it," he admitted, his tone raw but calm. "Not after what I did. What I didn't do. But you gave me a chance anyway." Emily closed the sketch pad, her eyes steady. "Mom believed in second chances," she said. "I figured I'd try it too. You're not perfect, Dad, but you're here. That's what counts." The word, Dad, still caught him off guard, a gift he hadn't earned but cherished. He smiled, faint but genuine, and reached for her hand, squeezing it briefly before letting go. "You're more like her than, you know," he said, "stronger than I ever was." She shrugged, a flicker of Clara's humility in the gesture, then stood. "Come on," she said, heading to the shed. "We've got wood left. Let's light a fire tonight, properly this time, no burning bread." Thomas followed, the morning unfolding around them as they gathered kindling, their movements a quiet dance of trust. The city skyline loomed in the distance, its towers glinting under the rising sun, but it felt far away, a relic of a life he'd shed. Edward Langston had faded too, his threats dissolving into silence after Thomas's refusal to bend. The press had moved on, chasing fresher scandals, leaving Thomas and Emily to rebuild in peace. That evening, they sat by the fire pit, the flames crackling as dusk bled into night. Emily tossed a stick into the blaze, watching it catch, while Thomas leaned back, the warmth brushing his face. The marigolds glowed in the flickering light, a circle of gold around them, and he felt the weight of the past lift. Not gone, but lighter, a burden shared. "I used to think honor was about winning," he said, his voice soft, reflective, the fire's glow softening the lines of his face. "Being untouchable, I was wrong. It's this, being here, keeping promises even when they're late." Emily looked at him, her eyes mirroring the flames. "Mom would say it's about who you are when no one's watching," she replied. "You're doing okay at that," he chuckled, the sound low and warm. "High praise from you," he said, then grew serious. "You're my honor, Emily. The best thing I've kept." She smiled, full and unguarded, and handed him a stick to toss into the fire. "You're mine too, Dad," she said, her voice steady, a cornerstone laid. "Now throw that in. We've got a fire to keep going." He did, the wood sparking as it hit the flames, and they sat together, the night wrapping around them like a quiet embrace. The city hummed faintly beyond the trees, its lights a distant constellation. But here by the fire, Thomas Grayson found what he'd sought all along. Not power, not fear, but a light born of sacrifice and love. Dawn crept closer, the first, rays brushing the horizon, and Thomas watched Emily tend the flames, her hands sure, her presence a testament to Clara's legacy. He'd lost an empire, faced betrayal, walked through storms, but he'd gained this, a daughter, a home, a dignity forged not in steel, but in the quiet strength of being there. The fire burned on, small but steady, a beacon in the dark he'd finally left behind. And there it is, a journey from the heights of power to the quiet glow of a fire-lit yard, where honor isn't won in boardrooms, but in the bonds we choose to keep. What did you think of this tale of redemption? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Give us a like if it moved you, and subscribe for more stories that prove it's never too late to find what truly matters. See you in the next one.